$142 million. That's what each F-35 costs the American taxpayer. A single aircraft. And for decades, military strategists have told us that this price tag buys untouchable dominance in the sky. Stealth technology, fifth-generation sensors, networked combat systems. The narrative is simple. The F-35 is invisible to enemy radar, and therefore, essentially invincible. But what if I told you that the real vulnerability of the F-35 isn't technological at all? It's not about radar signatures or missile guidance systems. It's about something far more dangerous, something that Iran's military planners completely miscalculated when they built their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that American jets couldn't be touched. The F-35's greatest weakness isn't visible on a radar screen. It's hidden in the very infrastructure that makes it operational in the first place. Every modern air force operates under a critical constraint that no amount of advanced technology can overcome: logistics. For every hour an F-35 spends in the sky conducting combat operations, it requires roughly 3 to 5 hours of ground maintenance. The aircraft needs fuel, it needs ammunition replenishment, it needs tire changes, hydraulic fluid checks, avionics calibration, and sensor realignment. These requirements don't go away just because you've painted your jet black and programmed it with cutting-edge software. In fact, stealth aircraft demand even more intensive maintenance protocols than conventional fighters. The radar-absorbing coating on the F-35's fuselage, the very thing that makes it difficult to detect, degrades with every mission. It cracks under the stress of supersonic flight. It corrodes when exposed to salt water and extreme temperatures. Every time a maintenance crew touches that coating to repair it, they risk compromising the stealth characteristics that cost billions to develop. This creates a vicious cycle where the more operationally effective the F-35 becomes, the more vulnerable its supporting infrastructure becomes to disruption. Here's what Iran's military establishment got catastrophically wrong in their assessment of American air power. They believed that if they couldn't detect the F-35 with radar, they couldn't defeat it. So they invested heavily in advanced surface-to-air missile systems. Russian S-400s, indigenous Khordad systems, upgrades to their air defense grid that could theoretically engage targets across massive geographical areas. They spent billions developing systems that could theoretically track objects moving at supersonic speeds across hundreds of kilometers of airspace. But they never seriously contemplated what would happen if you simply didn't need to fight the F-35 in the air at all. What if the vulnerability wasn't in the fighter jet itself, but in the forward operating bases that launch it? When the United States positions F-35 squadrons in the Middle East, they typically operate out of established forward operating bases in places like Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq. These bases are defended, but they're not impenetrable. They have perimeter security, air defense systems, and electronic countermeasures. But here's the fundamental problem. They're stationary. They don't move. An enemy knows exactly where they are, and they remain in those exact locations for months or years at a time. This creates an operational reality that contradicts everything we're told about stealth fighter superiority. If you can't shoot down an F-35 in the air because you can't see it with conventional radar, then the logical military response is to attack it on the ground before it ever gets airborne. You don't need sophisticated air-to-air missiles. You don't need advanced radar systems. You need precision ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, or drone swarms launched from territory you control, aimed at coordinates you've confirmed through satellite imagery and human intelligence. And here's where Iran's strategic miscalculation becomes glaringly obvious. Iran possesses extensive arsenals of ballistic missiles with ranges that extend far beyond their borders. The Shahab-3, with a range of roughly 2,000 kilometers, can reach any American military installation in the Middle East from Iranian territory. The Fateh 110, though shorter ranged, is mobile and extremely difficult to track before launch. The Zulfikar, the Ghadr, the Hajj missiles. Iran has dozens of delivery systems specifically designed to strike targets at extended range with sufficient accuracy to damage airfield infrastructure. Yet during the 2019-2020 period, when tensions escalated following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Iran's response was telling. They launched ballistic missiles at the Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, where American F-16s and other coalition aircraft were stationed. They successfully struck the base. But here's the critical detail. No F-35s were stationed at Al-Assad at that time. The F-35 squadrons were positioned elsewhere, at bases far enough removed from the immediate conflict zone that Iranian missiles couldn't reach them without operating from uncomfortably exposed positions or expanding their military reach in ways that would draw immediate American retaliation. This reveals the second layer of Iran's strategic vulnerability. They never developed the integrated intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance network required to locate, confirm, and engage mobile American air assets in real time. American air power doesn't just rely on individual aircraft like the F-35. It relies on a comprehensive ecosystem of sensors, communication networks, and command centers that operate across multiple platforms simultaneously. Satellites constantly monitor Iranian territory. Airborne radar platforms like the E-3 Sentry conduct persistent overwatch. Ground-based electronic intelligence systems intercept and analyze Iranian communications and radar emissions. And all of this information flows into central command nodes where targeting decisions are made in minutes or sometimes seconds. Iran has nothing comparable. Their surveillance capabilities are fragmented. Their command and control systems are vulnerable to disruption. Their communications networks can be jammed or intercepted. They can see where the F-35s are launched from. Any intelligence service can monitor which bases are being used. But once those aircraft get airborne, they essentially disappear into a blind spot. And by the time an Iranian operator reacquires the target, the F-35 has already traveled hundreds of kilometers away. What Iran fundamentally failed to account for when building their air defense strategy is that the F-35 was never designed to win in a traditional fighter-versus-fighter air combat scenario against older Iranian jets. That's not its primary purpose. The F-35's real advantage comes from sensor fusion, the ability to integrate information from dozens of sources into a single comprehensive picture of the tactical environment. An F-35 flying over Iranian territory doesn't just rely on its own radar. It's receiving real-time targeting data from satellite systems. It's getting communications intercepts from signals intelligence platforms. It's getting threat warnings from electronic warfare systems. It's sharing information with other F-35s operating in the same area, creating a network where every aircraft extends the sensor range of every other aircraft. This is called network-centric warfare, and it represents a capability gap so vast that traditional air defense systems, even sophisticated ones, become almost irrelevant. An Iranian air defense operator sitting in a command center trying to coordinate missile launches against these networked American fighters is essentially trying to play three-dimensional chess while his opponent is playing on 4 dimensions. He can see the board where the pieces are currently positioned, but he can't see where they're moving next because the American Air Force already knows where he is, what he's doing, and what his weapons are capable of. But here's where the narrative gets even more complicated, and where Iran's strategic planners made their most critical error. They treated the F-35 as a primarily offensive platform, when in reality, from Iran's defensive perspective, the aircraft's greatest impact comes from its ability to suppress and degrade enemy air defenses without ever actually engaging them directly. This is called suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD, and it works like this. An F-35, using its integrated sensor suite, can detect the electronic emissions from an Iranian radar system from extremely long distances. The moment that radar powers on, the F-35 knows its location, its frequency, its range, and its engagement envelope. The F-35 pilot can then relay that information to other assets, cruise missiles, attack aircraft, drone swarms, that can be directed to attack the radar station or the command center controlling it. This forces Iranian air defense operators into an impossible choice: keep their radar systems powered on and risk being detected and attacked, or keep them powered off and lose the ability to see incoming targets. Either way, they're compromised. Either way, they're defeated. This is why the most advanced air defense systems in the world, systems that cost billions and require years of training to operate, become essentially useless against a modern American air power package centered around the F-35. The traditional understanding of air superiority, one air force having more powerful fighters than another, is antiquated. Modern air superiority is about information dominance. It's about who sees the enemy first, who understands the tactical situation most completely, and who can act on that information fastest. Iran's military planners built their defensive strategy as if they were preparing to fight the air wars of the 1980s or 1990s, where individual pilots in individual aircraft made individual decisions based on what they could see with their own eyes and instruments. They invested in radar systems optimized for detecting incoming aircraft. They deployed fighters designed to intercept and engage American bombers. They positioned air defense missiles to create layered defense networks across their territory. All of this made perfect sense against earlier generations of American air power. Against F-15s and F-16s and B-52 bombers operating largely independently, these defensive measures would have created genuine tactical challenges. But against an integrated network of fifth-generation fighters, satellite surveillance, cyber warfare capabilities, and rapidly evolving drone systems, this entire defensive architecture became obsolete before it was even fully deployed. And the worst part, from Iran's perspective, is that this obsolescence became apparent in real time during actual military operations where they had no ability to adjust or adapt without completely rebuilding their military. When American aircraft operated over Iranian airspace during strikes against Iranian-backed militias and weapons facilities, Iran's air defense systems activated repeatedly. They acquired targets, they painted them with radar, they attempted to guide missiles toward them, and in virtually every case, the missiles either missed entirely or were evaded by American aircraft. The few times Iranian air defenses came close to scoring hits, most notably during the January 2020 missile strikes against American bases in Iraq, the targets were either stationary positions that had been vacated, or they were slower, less sophisticated aircraft that didn't have the advanced electronic warfare systems that F-35's possess. Every time an F-35 operated over Iranian airspace, every time American forces demonstrated the capability to operate with impunity within Iran's claimed defensive envelope, it eroded the credibility and viability of Iran's entire deterrence posture, and Iran's leadership had to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had spent billions of dollars building a military force designed to make American airstrikes prohibitively expensive, only to discover that American air power had evolved in ways that rendered that entire force irrelevant. The F-35, in this sense, wasn't just a weapon system, it was a strategic messenger, and the message was clear. Iran's traditional military capabilities cannot successfully defend against modern American air power. This is where the conversation becomes genuinely dangerous, because the logical conclusion that Iranian military strategists would draw from this realization is that their survival depends not on trying to compete with American conventional military power, a competition they have already lost, but on developing and deploying asymmetrical capabilities that can't be countered by traditional military systems. If American air power is truly untouchable, then Iran's only viable option becomes developing nuclear weapons as a deterrent. If conventional military forces have become irrelevant against American technological superiority, then terrorism, cyber warfare, proxy militias, and weapons of mass destruction become the only languages in which Iran can still speak with credibility. And this is precisely what we've seen unfold over the past several years. Iran has dramatically escalated its nuclear weapons development program. It has expanded its drone technology capabilities to become one of the world's leading producers of unmanned weapons. It has invested heavily in cyber warfare capabilities aimed at American infrastructure. It has doubled down on support for proxy militias across the region, because those proxy militias represent the only military tools left that don't immediately become obsolete when facing American air power. In other words, the F-35's technological dominance has paradoxically made the world more dangerous, not less. The uncomfortable geopolitical reality that most Western military analysts won't openly discuss is this. When you demonstrate absolute military superiority over a rival state in conventional warfare, you don't actually achieve stability or deterrence. You achieve desperation. You corner your opponent into a position where they have nothing to lose by pursuing extreme options. The F-35, for all its advanced capabilities and astronomical price tag, is fundamentally a defensive tool when viewed from the perspective of Western military strategy. It's designed to prevent enemies from attacking American interests or American allies. But from the perspective of the nation being deterred, Iran, China, Russia, or any other peer or near-peer competitor, it's experienced as an existential threat. It's the tool that makes your entire military obsolete. It's the system that eliminates your strategic options. And when you eliminate someone's options, they stop negotiating. They stop trying to achieve their objectives through diplomatic means. They start looking for ways to develop capabilities so destabilizing, so dangerous, so divorced from traditional military norms, that they can threaten the very infrastructure that American power depends on. They look toward nuclear weapons. They look toward cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. They look toward biological weapons. They look toward whatever asymmetrical tools they can develop to counterbalance an opponent's technological dominance. The reference guide that goes much deeper into how this arms race dynamic has historically played out, and how it might play out in the future, is available in the description and pinned comment. Understanding this pattern is critical to understanding why military technology doesn't always translate into political or strategic advantage the way policymakers expect. The broader historical pattern shows this dynamic repeating constantly. When the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, it didn't make the world safer for American planners. It made it more dangerous, because it forced the Soviets to accept an uncomfortable new reality about their place in international affairs. When America developed the hydrogen bomb, it forced the Soviets to develop their own hydrogen bomb, and the cycle escalated. When America developed stealth bombers, other nations began investing in stealth detection systems. When America developed advanced satellite reconnaissance, other nations started developing satellite destruction capabilities. The F-35, viewed through this lens, is simply the most recent iteration of a pattern that stretches back decades. Technological dominance triggers counter-innovation triggers escalation, and escalation creates instability. The tragic irony is that Iran's military establishment actually understood this pattern better than many American strategists do. They knew that developing conventional military capabilities to match American fighter jets was economically unsustainable and strategically futile. So instead of trying to build a better F-35, they did exactly what strategic theory predicts they would do. They shifted their investment toward asymmetrical capabilities. They accelerated their nuclear program. They invested in ballistic missile development. They created regional proxy networks. They developed sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities. They did all of this not because they wanted to, but because the F-35, through its very existence and technological dominance, forced them toward these options. What makes this dynamic particularly dangerous in the case of Iran is the religious and ideological dimensions of Iranian strategic culture. Iran's decision-makers don't operate from purely rational calculations of military power balances the way Western strategists assume they do. They operate within a complex framework where religious legitimacy, ideological consistency, and resistance to foreign domination are equally important considerations. When Iran's military establishment confronts the reality that American air power is technologically untouchable, they face not just a military problem but a legitimacy crisis. They've spent decades telling their population that Iran can defend itself against foreign aggression. They've built entire institutions around this narrative of defensive strength and resistance. The F-35, through its very operational existence, undermines that narrative. Every time American aircraft operate over Iranian airspace without consequence, every time Iranian air defense systems fail to achieve results, the credibility of Iran's military and political leadership erodes. And when that credibility erodes, the regime faces internal pressure to respond in dramatic ways to restore its image of strength. This is why Iran launched those ballistic missiles against Al-Assad Air Base in January 2020. The military strike itself didn't achieve significant damage or create substantial military costs for the United States. But symbolically and politically, it allowed Iran's leadership to tell their domestic audience that they had responded to American actions with force. They had demonstrated that Iran could strike back. The military effectiveness of the strike was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the political message to Iran's population: we are not powerless. This need to maintain political legitimacy through military posturing becomes particularly dangerous when combined with the reality that Iran's conventional military capabilities have become effectively obsolete. A regime that feels its internal legitimacy slipping is a regime that becomes more likely to take risky military actions. A military establishment that can't compete with American technology becomes more likely to use the asymmetrical tools it does possess: terrorism, proxy militias, cyber attacks, weapons of mass destruction, in ways that might provoke escalation spirals neither side ultimately wants. The F-35's technological dominance, in this sense, doesn't prevent conflict between America and Iran. It makes conflict more likely by eliminating the space for conventional military deterrence and forcing both sides toward more destabilizing tools. The deeper analysis of how this escalation dynamic could unfold geopolitically and what policymakers should be paying attention to is available in the description and on our pinned comment, where we've put together comprehensive resources on the strategic implications of fifth-generation fighter dominance and how rising powers typically respond. The unsaid truth that military analysts rarely discuss in mainstream channels is this: the F-35's greatest strategic achievement isn't defeating enemy fighters or suppressing enemy air defenses, though it does both. Its greatest strategic achievement is forcing every potential American adversary to confront the reality that they cannot compete with the United States on the traditional military playing field. And when a nation confronts that reality, when it recognizes that it has lost the conventional military competition before the first shot is fired, it stops building tanks and air defense systems and fighter jets. It starts building nuclear weapons. It starts developing cyber warfare capabilities targeting critical American infrastructure. It starts creating asymmetrical threats, so destabilizing that conventional military superiority becomes almost irrelevant. Iran's military establishment understood this transition better than most. They accelerated their nuclear program. They developed the ballistic missiles to deliver nuclear weapons. They created sophisticated regional proxy networks that can operate independently of Iranian Air Force protection. They developed cyber warfare capabilities targeting American government agencies and critical infrastructure. All of these moves make perfect sense when viewed through the lens of a military establishment that has already lost the conventional competition and is now pursuing survival strategies appropriate to a world where traditional military power is irrelevant. Most discussions of the F-35 focus on its technological achievements: the stealth design, the sensor fusion capability, the advanced avionics, the ability to operate in contested airspace where older generation aircraft would be immediately detected and engaged. These are all genuine achievements, but they're also achievements that we've become somewhat accustomed to in discussions of American military superiority. Every generation of American military technology comes with claims about revolutionary capabilities that will change warfare forever. The F-15 was supposed to be untouchable in air combat. The B-2 stealth bomber was supposed to make air defense systems obsolete. The Patriot missile system was supposed to make enemy air attacks impossible. And in their respective time periods, these systems did represent genuine advances in capability. But they also created the conditions for escalation and counter-innovation that we see playing out now. The pattern is always the same. America introduces a revolutionary military capability that provides overwhelming advantage. That advantage allows America to achieve military and political objectives that would otherwise be difficult or impossible. Other nations, watching this advantage in operation, recognize that they need to develop counter-capabilities or risk permanent military inferiority. They invest in research and development. They purchase or reverse engineer technologies that might provide some degree of parity or asymmetrical response. The advantage slowly erodes as the technology matures, and other nations acquire or develop their own versions. By the time this erosion is well advanced, America has already introduced the next generation of revolutionary capability, and the cycle repeats. The F-35 is currently in the middle of this cycle. It still provides overwhelming advantage against anything Iran can deploy conventionally. But other nations, most notably China and Russia, are developing their own fifth-generation fighters and advanced air defense systems specifically designed to counter the capabilities that make the F-35 dominant. The Chinese J-20 stealth fighter and the Russian Su-57 are both responses to the F-35's development. Advanced air defense systems like the Russian S-500 are being specifically designed to counter stealth aircraft. Within a decade or two, the F-35's advantage will have substantially eroded as other nations acquire equivalent technology. And when that happens, the global strategic balance will shift again. America will have either introduced the next revolutionary capability or will have found itself in a position where its technological advantages have been neutralized by counter-innovation. The F-35 never solved the fundamental problem that all military technology ultimately confronts. Technology advantages are temporary. They erode, they get counter-innovated, they become obsolete. The real military advantage comes not from having better technology at any given moment, but from having the capability to continuously innovate faster than your adversaries can. America's true advantage isn't the F-35 itself. It's the military-industrial complex that continuously produces new generations of capability. It's the research universities and defense contractors and government laboratories that are already developing systems that will make the F-35 obsolete in another 15 or 20 years. It's the pilot training systems and operational doctrine that allows American pilots to use current-generation technology more effectively than pilots from other nations. It's the logistics networks and support systems that keep advanced aircraft operational in the field. It's all of this combined. The F-35 is just the current-generation manifestation of a deeper advantage: America's ability to field and maintain advanced military systems at scale and sustain operations continuously over decades. This is why Iran's military establishment, for all their sophistication and strategic acumen, ultimately faces an unwinnable competition if they try to match American conventional military power system for system, generation for generation. They don't have the economic capacity, they don't have the industrial base, they don't have access to the advanced chip manufacturing and materials science that modern military technology requires. Even if they spent every resource they have on developing their own stealth fighters and advanced air defense systems, they would always be fighting to catch up to systems America has already moved beyond. This is the real strategic asymmetry in the competition between America and Iran. It's not about the F-35 specifically. It's about the broader institutional and economic capacity to generate military innovation continuously. Iran can't compete with that. Russia struggles to compete with that. Only China has even a remote chance of eventually competing with that. And this realization is what drove Iran's strategic shift toward asymmetrical capabilities. They correctly understood that the only way to create strategic uncertainty from an American perspective is to develop capabilities that don't depend on matching American conventional military power. Nuclear weapons create strategic uncertainty because they threaten consequences no conventional military advantage can mitigate. Cyber warfare creates strategic uncertainty because it threatens American civilians and critical infrastructure in ways that fighter jets don't address. Terrorism and proxy militias create strategic uncertainty because they can inflict costs that don't require fighting American forces directly. These are the tools available to nations that have lost or are losing the conventional military competition. These are the tools Iran has chosen to pursue. The uncomfortable reality that becomes visible when you examine Iran's military strategy through this lens is that the F-35, for all its technological dominance, may actually have made the world less safe rather than more safe. By demonstrating the absolute superiority of American conventional military power so comprehensively, it forced potential adversaries toward asymmetrical strategies that don't have built-in constraints or rules of engagement. A nation trying to compete with America militarily operates within a framework of conventional warfare where there are at least some implicit understandings about proportionality and escalation limits. A nation that has given up on conventional competition and is instead developing nuclear weapons and cyber warfare capabilities operates in a much more dangerous space where the potential for catastrophic escalation is far higher. This is the paradox at the heart of military technology strategy. The most effective deterrent is often the one that makes the other side most desperate. And desperation is when nations do their most dangerous things. Thank you for watching this deep dive into how the F-35's technological dominance inadvertently reshaped Iran's entire strategic posture. If you want to understand how military technology shapes geopolitical behavior in ways that extend far beyond the battlefield, make sure you're subscribed to Gray Zone Intel, hit the like button, and turn on your notifications so you never miss when we release new breakdowns of the hidden conflicts and covert operations reshaping global affairs. We'll see you in the next one. But here's what most people miss about this entire equation. The technological gap between Iran and the F-35 created something far more dangerous than a simple military imbalance. It created a cascade of second- and third-order effects that rippled through Iran's entire strategic calculation. When a nation realizes it cannot defeat an adversary through conventional means, it doesn't simply accept defeat. It looks for asymmetric options. And those options are far messier, far less predictable, and infinitely more volatile. Iran's response to American air superiority wasn't to build more F-16s or upgrade their aging air defense grid. It was to double down on something they could control: irregular warfare networks. Over the past decade, Iran has poured resources into creating a shadow military apparatus that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. These are proxy forces, militias, and non-state actors that operate under Iranian guidance but maintain plausible deniability. A drone strike on an Iranian military installation can be met with retaliation through a militia in Iraq. A cyber attack on Iranian infrastructure can be answered by disruptions to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, but conducted by independent actors with no official connection to Tehran. The F-35 made conventional deterrence useless against Iran, so Iran weaponized unconventional deterrence instead. Every proxy militia became a potential response mechanism. Every cyber cell became a pressure point. Every maritime disruption became leverage. This is what we call the strategic diffusion problem. When one side has overwhelming conventional superiority, the losing side doesn't negotiate. It finds 1,000 ways to make the other side regret ever wanting a conflict in the first place. The Iranian military hierarchy understood this perfectly. They had studied American interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. They had watched how even the most technologically dominant force struggles against distributed networks of insurgents. So they built their own network. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, particularly the Quds Force, became an architect of asymmetric power projection. They created redundancy at every level. If one proxy group was eliminated, 3 others could activate in its place. If one weapons cache was discovered, 5 more were already in position. And here's the critical detail that changes everything about how we understand this situation. Iran didn't just build military proxies. They built them with specific capabilities designed to target American weaknesses, not American strengths. The F-35 dominates in the air, so Iran's proxy networks focused on maritime threats, cyber capabilities, and drone swarming tactics that don't require air superiority. They developed anti-ship missiles that could threaten American naval convoys in the Persian Gulf. They invested in drone technology that could overwhelm air defenses through sheer numbers rather than technological sophistication. The Iranians took a lesson from Turkey, from China, from any nation that has studied how to asymmetrically counter American military dominance. They understood that you don't beat the F-35 by building a better fighter jet. You beat it by making the entire environment in which the F-35 operates hostile and costly. You threaten the airfields where it operates. You develop anti-radar missiles that force it to fly higher or evade, burning fuel and limiting its combat radius. You weaponize the gray zone between war and peace, the space where conventional deterrence doesn't apply. This is why the F-35's dominance, paradoxically, may have made the Middle East more dangerous, not less. When America had only conventional superiority, Iran at least had the theoretical possibility of negotiating from a position of parity through diplomatic channels. But once the F-35 arrived in theater, Iran lost that conventional parity forever. The gap became so vast that the only rational response was to abandon conventional competition entirely and embrace unconventional methods. By 2019 and 2020, when F-35s were actively operating in the region, Iranian military planners had already shifted their entire strategic doctrine. They were no longer building to win a conventional war against the United States. They were building to make a conventional war so costly, so destructive to American interests and allies, that the political will to launch one would evaporate. This is compellence through pain. This is deterrence through demonstrated capability to harm. The Iranian Navy developed strategies for swarming American ships with small speedboats, armed with anti-ship missiles and suicide drone capabilities. Not because they could defeat a carrier strike group in open combat. They can't. The F-35 would annihilate them. But because forcing an American carrier to divert or cancel operations due to persistent harassment is a strategic victory without a single shot being fired. If Iran can make American naval operations in the Persian Gulf costly enough in terms of risk, political capital, and operational disruption, they've effectively challenged American dominance without challenging American military superiority. This represents a fundamental shift in how regional powers respond to technological dominance. It's no longer about matching the enemy's technology, it's about identifying where that technology is vulnerable. The F-35 can't protect every airfield, every ship, every piece of infrastructure that the United States cares about. It can't be everywhere at once. And in asymmetric warfare, you don't need to be able to defeat your enemy everywhere. You only need to be able to hurt them in the places they care about most. Cyber operations became another avenue through which Iran could asymmetrically retaliate against technological superiority. While the F-35 represented physical dominance in the air, Iranian cyber units could attack American infrastructure, financial systems, and communications networks with minimal risk of conventional retaliation. A cyber attack that takes down an American port or disrupts power grids isn't addressed by fighter jets. It requires a completely different response mechanism, one that's slower, more complicated, and far more politically sensitive. If you want the full breakdown of how Iran's asymmetric doctrine evolved in response to American technological dominance, and the specific proxy networks that emerged as a result, we've got a detailed analysis in the description and in the pinned comment that goes far deeper into this strategic shift. It's critical context for understanding why technological dominance sometimes creates the conditions for escalation rather than stability. The second-order consequence was even more complicated. When Iran knew it couldn't win a conventional war, it also knew it couldn't appear weak domestically. The Iranian leadership has always ruled through a combination of ideology and demonstrated strength. If the regime admits that American technology has rendered its military strategy obsolete, the political legitimacy of the government comes into question. So instead, Iranian propaganda emphasized the development of unconventional capabilities as a superior strategy. Asymmetric warfare became, in Iranian messaging, a demonstration of revolutionary innovation and strategic brilliance, rather than a response to technological inferiority. This domestic messaging problem created its own escalatory spiral. Having publicly committed to asymmetric deterrence, Iranian military leaders couldn't simply dial back their rhetoric or reduce their proxy investments without appearing to have lost face. They had to actually deliver on the capabilities they had promised. They had to demonstrate that their unconventional strategies were working. And the way you demonstrate asymmetric deterrence is by actually employing it, which is why we saw increasing proxy attacks, increasing maritime disruptions, and increasing cyber operations throughout the 2018 to 2023 period. The F-35, in other words, didn't just change Iran's military strategy. It changed Iran's entire strategic narrative. It forced Iranian leadership to explain to its population why American technological dominance wasn't a threat that should prompt capitulation, but rather evidence of a deeper competition that Iran could win through alternative means. Whether that narrative is actually true or not is almost irrelevant. What matters is that it became the official doctrine of the Iranian state, and once a doctrine is institutionalized, it becomes difficult to reverse without losing credibility. This is the trap that advanced military technology creates. When you achieve such overwhelming superiority that your opponent cannot compete, you force that opponent into either capitulation or asymmetric warfare. And asymmetric warfare, while less destructive than conventional war, is far more unpredictable. A country that has given up on conventional deterrence has fewer red lines. It's more willing to take risks. It's more likely to miscalculate, because the entire strategic framework that usually prevents catastrophic war has been abandoned. What makes this situation even more dangerous is that Iran's asymmetric strategy now operates without the guardrails of mutual vulnerability. When both sides possessed roughly equivalent conventional forces, there was a natural brake on escalation. You didn't launch a massive attack because you knew the response would be equally massive. But when one side has overwhelmingly superior technology, that brake disappears. Iran's decision-makers no longer fear a proportional response. They fear obliteration, and that fear pushes them toward unpredictability rather than caution. The F-35, in this context, isn't just a weapons system. It's a doctrine killer. It's a machine that fundamentally breaks the assumptions upon which an entire national strategy was built. And when a nation's strategic doctrine breaks, the predictability that allows diplomacy and deterrence to function begins to crack as well. This is why military analysts have been quietly alarmed by Iran's response pattern since the 2024 strikes, because it shows no signs of accepting the new reality. Instead, it shows signs of doubling down on a strategy that has been proven obsolete. Iran's military leadership has publicly announced expanded drone production. They've increased funding for ballistic missile programs. They've accelerated their naval operations in the Persian Gulf. Every single one of these moves is a response to the F-35 strikes, but none of them address the fundamental problem. You cannot build a defense against an aircraft you cannot see. You cannot coordinate air defense systems against a target that appears on your radar for less than a second before it delivers its payload. You cannot win an arms race with a technology that has already left you behind by a generation. What Iran is actually doing is building a bigger haystack while the needle continues to get sharper. And this is where the asymmetric trap becomes truly dangerous. Because eventually, after enough failed conventional responses, after enough military exercises that prove nothing, after enough expanded budgets spent on systems that cannot solve the core problem, a nation's leadership faces a choice. They can accept strategic defeat, which for a regime that built its legitimacy on resistance means accepting the loss of power. Or they can escalate beyond conventional military response into territory that conventional deterrence cannot predict or prevent. This is why military strategists are watching Iran's next moves with such intensity. The F-35 strikes didn't just damage military installations. They eliminated Iran's ability to execute its core strategic doctrine without accepting massive vulnerability. And a state that cannot execute its doctrine without accepting massive vulnerability will eventually try something different. Something more desperate, something less constrained by the traditional rules of military engagement. The asymmetric trap snaps shut not when you deliver the first blow, but when your opponent realizes that all their planned responses are now obsolete. What most observers missed in the immediate aftermath of the strikes is that Iran's response wasn't actually designed to succeed militarily. It was designed to preserve face domestically, while avoiding triggering a larger conflict. The drone and missile barrage was calculated theater, meant to show the Iranian population and the broader Islamic world that Tehran was not passively accepting Israeli and American action. But the strikes were telegraphed, fired from predictable locations, and launched with enough warning time for air defenses to be fully activated. This wasn't an attempt to achieve tactical victory. This was an attempt to avoid strategic humiliation while staying below the threshold of all-out war. But here's the problem with that approach. When you're trapped in an asymmetric situation, half measures don't work. Symbolic gestures don't change the underlying power imbalance, and they certainly don't restore the strategic doctrine that's been shattered. So Iran fired its ballistic missiles knowing they would likely be intercepted. It launched its drones knowing they would likely be shot down. It conducted a military operation that was almost mathematically guaranteed to fail in purely tactical terms, but had to be conducted anyway because the alternative was accepting strategic defeat without any response at all. This is the hidden cost of overwhelming technological superiority. It doesn't just defeat an opponent's weapons. It defeats their ability to respond in any meaningful way. And when a nation cannot respond meaningfully, it is left with only symbolic responses, which are slowly but inevitably perceived as weakness. Each symbolic response that fails becomes evidence to both internal and external audiences that the nation's strategy has failed. Each failed response further delegitimizes the leadership that conceived it. And each leadership delegitimization increases the pressure for a more dramatic response, a more desperate gamble, a move that breaks past the careful calculus of deterrence into something genuinely unpredictable. Iran's next move in this escalating cycle isn't predetermined. It could be a cyber attack on critical infrastructure. It could be an expansion of proxy operations through Hezbollah or Houthi forces. It could be an attempted assassination of Israeli or American officials. It could be a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Or it could be a direct attack using weapons that haven't been tested in combat yet, deployed in ways that Western air defenses haven't prepared for. The specific form of the next escalation is unknowable, but the pattern is now locked in place. Each failed conventional response increases pressure for an unconventional one. And this is where the F-35's true strategic impact becomes visible. It's not just superior to Iranian air defenses. It has fundamentally altered the risk-reward calculation of conventional military operations. For Iran, conventional war is now a losing proposition. But accepting that proposition means accepting strategic defeat. So the nation will increasingly move into unconventional operations, where the F-35 cannot be used, where Western air superiority becomes irrelevant, where the asymmetry can be partially reversed. This is the doctrine of the future, emerging in real time from the wreckage of the old doctrine. If you want to understand how this specific conflict develops from here, there's a detailed analysis in the description and pinned comment that maps out the 3 most likely Iranian escalation pathways and what each one would mean for regional stability. It's the kind of strategic breakdown that gets buried in academic journals, but deserves to be part of the public conversation about what's actually happening in the Middle East. The broader lesson, though, extends far beyond Iran. Every nation watching these strikes has drawn the same conclusion. Conventional military superiority is no longer sufficient. You need technological superiority that is so overwhelming that your opponent cannot even detect you, let alone respond to you. This is why every major military power on the planet is now investing billions into stealth technology, AI-driven air defense systems, autonomous weapons platforms, and next-generation sensor networks. Because the F-35 strikes showed that the nation with the biggest army doesn't win anymore. The nation with the technology that makes armies irrelevant does. China is accelerating its stealth fighter program. Russia is deploying new air defense systems. Every NATO member is either acquiring F-35's or developing their own fifth-generation equivalents. India is building advanced fighter jets. Even smaller nations are exploring hypersonic missile technology and drone swarm systems. Because they all understand the message that the F-35 strikes sent. Conventional deterrence is dead. The new deterrence is technological invisibility. But here's what keeps military strategists up at night. Not all nations will acquire this technology, and not all nations will accept strategic defeat in silence. We are entering an era where military capability is increasingly bifurcated. On one side, you have nations with access to fifth-generation stealth aircraft, AI-driven defense systems, and space-based surveillance networks. On the other side, you have nations with conventional armies, ballistic missiles, and the growing desperation that comes from knowing you cannot win a conventional war. This bifurcation creates instability in ways that previous military revolutions did not. Because at least with nuclear weapons, both sides had the bomb. With stealth technology, one side has it and the other side doesn't. And that asymmetry is a breeding ground for miscalculation. The F-35 didn't just strike Iranian military targets. It struck at the assumptions that have governed Middle Eastern strategic thinking for decades. It proved that borders can be penetrated, that air defense systems are obsolete, that conventional deterrence is no longer viable. And in proving those things, it forced every regional actor into a reassessment of their own strategic position. Some will accelerate their pursuit of asymmetric capabilities. Some will seek new alliances with powers that possess fifth-generation technology. Some will attempt to develop their own stealth systems. And some, facing no viable military options, will simply accept strategic subordination and hope that the dominant power does not use its overwhelming superiority to reshape the region entirely. This is the world that advanced military technology is creating. Not a world of diplomatic settlement and mutual deterrence, but a world of technological hierarchy and strategic hopelessness for those left behind. And the moment when that hierarchy becomes truly visible, when everyone can see which nations have fifth-generation aircraft and which ones don't, is the moment when regional stability begins to deteriorate in unpredictable ways. This is the world that advanced military technology is creating. Not a world of diplomatic settlement and mutual deterrence, but a world of technological hierarchy and strategic hopelessness for those left behind. And the moment when that hierarchy becomes truly visible, when everyone can see which nations have fifth-generation aircraft and which ones don't, is the moment when regional stability begins to deteriorate in unpredictable ways. The ripple effects extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. When adversaries realize their air defenses cannot function as designed, when they understand that stealth technology represents not just a tactical advantage but a fundamental redefinition of air power itself, the calculus of national security shifts overnight. Countries that invested billions in surface-to-air missile systems, platforms they believed would protect them for decades, now face the reality that those systems are essentially obsolete against a determined opponent equipped with fifth-generation fighters. This creates a cascading crisis of confidence. Nations that cannot afford to compete in the fifth-generation arms race begin to question their alliance structures. They wonder whether their existing partnerships provide sufficient security guarantees. They recalculate whether remaining aligned with one superpower might expose them to vulnerability if that superpower's rivals possess overwhelming technological superiority. In the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, these calculations are happening simultaneously, and they are reshaping geopolitical alignments faster than diplomats can track. The Iranian Air Force watched the April 2024 strike with the full knowledge that their F-4 Phantom jets, acquired in the 1970s and now nearly 50 years old, would be completely powerless against an adversary equipped with F-35's. They watched as Israel demonstrated the maturity of its integrated air defense suppression capability. They saw, in real time, what a technological mismatch looks like when one side operates stealth aircraft and the other side operates platforms from the Cold War era. And that realization cascades through Iranian military planning. It affects how they structure their defense doctrine. It influences whether they invest in longer-range ballistic missiles as a compensatory strategy. It shapes their willingness to supply proxy forces with advanced weapons. It even affects their diplomatic posture toward regional rivals and their calculations about whether nuclear weapons acquisition might be necessary to offset conventional military inferiority. This is how technology becomes geopolitics, not through dramatic policy announcements or formal strategic shifts, but through the quiet, irrevocable demonstration that one nation's military has evolved beyond the defensive reach of another nation's armed forces. Once that threshold is crossed, no amount of diplomatic dialogue can restore the previous sense of security. No arms control agreement can reverse the knowledge that asymmetry exists at this scale. The broader strategic implication is even more unsettling. The world's military powers are watching this exact same sequence unfold, but they are observing it through different lenses. Nations with advanced air forces are drawing confidence from the Israeli demonstration. They are refining their own operating concepts for stealth aircraft. They are integrating lessons about sensor fusion, electronic warfare integration, and air defense suppression into their doctrine. They are preparing for a world where fifth-generation aircraft define the ceiling of conventional warfare capability. Meanwhile, nations without fifth-generation aircraft are calculating how to survive in that world. Some will accelerate military modernization programs, spending trillions to acquire or develop their own stealth platforms. Some will attempt to forge new alliances with powers that possess fifth-generation technology, trading strategic autonomy for security guarantees. Some will pursue asymmetric strategies, developing hypersonic weapons, advanced cyber capabilities, autonomous drone swarms, that might offer them some avenue to inflict costs on a superior opponent without meeting it in direct air combat. And some nations, facing no viable military options, will simply accept strategic subordination. They will position themselves within the sphere of influence of whatever power has achieved technological dominance in their region. They will hope, often against reason, that this dominant power will not use its overwhelming superiority to reshape the region entirely, to overthrow inconvenient governments, to rewrite the rules of international conduct to suit its interests. This is the true cost of the technological gap revealed by the F-35's performance during the April 2024 strikes. It is not measured in aircraft shot down or missiles intercepted. It is measured in the permanent alteration of how nations perceive their security and calculate their strategic options. The F-35 has become more than a weapons system. It has become a symbol of a new era in warfare, one in which stealth, sensor fusion, and network integration have created a form of air superiority so comprehensive that traditional air defense becomes nearly meaningless. And that symbolic power, that demonstration effect, may ultimately prove more consequential than any single kinetic engagement. When adversaries can no longer defend against your air force, deterrence does not follow. Deterrence requires credibility of defense. What follows instead is capitulation or escalation. And in a region already bristling with tensions, already divided by sectarian conflict and resource competition, the demonstration that one side has achieved unchallenged air superiority does not lead to stability. It leads to increasingly desperate attempts by other powers to find some asymmetric response, some way to inflict costs that might restore a sense of balance. The April 2024 strikes revealed something that everyone suspected, but nobody could prove until the moment of execution. The technological gap between fifth-generation and fourth-generation aviation has become so vast that it has essentially negated the defensive paradigm that has shaped Middle Eastern military planning for decades. This realization will ripple through military establishments, intelligence agencies, and policy circles for years to come. Nations will accelerate procurement programs. Alliance structures will shift. Regional powers will pursue new weapons systems with urgency previously unknown. And all of it stems from a single, irrefutable fact demonstrated across a single night. When one side has fifth-generation aircraft and the other side does not, the side without them loses before the conflict even begins. This is the hidden conflict that shapes our world right now. Not the wars we see on the news, but the technological race that determines which nations will retain strategic autonomy and which ones will become dependent on the protection, and therefore the decisions, of a more advanced power. The F-35 may be just one aircraft, but it represents the threshold where military capability becomes so asymmetric that it fundamentally alters the equation of power in an entire region. If you want a much deeper analysis of how fifth-generation aircraft are reshaping regional deterrence structures and the specific vulnerabilities that older air defense systems cannot address, I've put together a complete resource in the description and pinned comment that breaks down the technical and strategic implications layer by layer. The military establishments watching these developments are already adapting. They are restructuring their doctrines, reallocating budgets, and reconsidering partnerships. They understand that the technological hierarchy that governs modern warfare has been made explicit, and there is no going back to a world where older air defense systems could reasonably hope to defend against a determined opponent with stealth aircraft. What happens next will determine whether the next decade sees regional stability or cascading instability. Nations that can afford to upgrade their air defenses will do so. Nations that cannot will face a choice between accepting subordination or pursuing destabilizing strategies. And the world will watch to see whether technological dominance can coexist with regional peace, or whether it inevitably produces the kind of strategic desperation that leads to wider conflict. The full technical breakdown, including the specific radar frequencies that stealth aircraft defeat, the integration layers that make evasion possible, and the regional implications for nations currently without fifth-generation aircraft, is all waiting in the pinned comment and the channel description. That resource will walk you through exactly how these systems function and why the gap between fifth and fourth-generation aviation has become so definitively catastrophic for those on the wrong side of it. Thanks so much for watching this breakdown. If this kind of deep dive analysis into how modern military technology reshapes geopolitical strategy interests you, hit that subscribe button and activate the notification bell. That way, whenever we